Welcome to my Bard story.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're focusing our attention on a really pivotal section in the book of Genesis.
That's right. We're moving from the very end of chapter 4, starting in verse 25, and then tracing that lineage all the way through chapter 5 up to verse 11.
We're exploring the period that follows, well, that devastating tragedy of Cain and Abel.
How Adam's family begins again, essentially.
And how that crucial line of hope starts its long journey, the one that eventually leads towards Noah.
Our study note for this passage is, wow, it's packed with incredible insights. It really reveals layers of meaning about hope, about the very nature of worship.
The stark reality of human mortality.
And above all, God's unwavering faithfulness. You really see it interwoven into these earliest chapters of human history.
So our mission today is to unpack this foundational text.
Not just reading it, but exploring it verse by verse.
Right, digging into some fascinating scholarly perspectives that shed light on the context and, the significance.
And most importantly, considering what this ancient history means for you today, especially for those of you involved in leading and teaching in the church. Hashtag verse by verse explanation. So let's jump right in. We'll start with Genesis 4, verse 25, using the New International Version. Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel since Cain killed him.
This verse is, well, it's incredibly significant, isn't it?
It really shifts the whole tone.
It immediately shifts the entire narrative after the deep darkness and despair following Cain's shocking act of murder and, the subsequent judgment and exile.
The story could have just ended there in sorrow.
It could have, but it doesn't. And that phrase, made love to his wife again, it uses the Hebrew word yada.
Yada, okay.
And the notes highlight this. It's far richer than just a description of the physical act. It means to know.
Like a deep, intimate knowledge.
Exactly. Personal, experiential.
Yeah.
Using yada here for the marital relationship, especially after such profound trauma, it emphasizes the continuation of life, intimacy, the covenant relationship within marriage.
Even when everything around them feels broken?
Right. It signifies that despite the violence, the loss, the fractured family, life continues according to God's original design and under his continued blessing.
And Eve's response when she gives birth to Seth, it's so deeply revealing of her spiritual state at this moment, isn't it?
It really is.
The notes really draw out that striking contrast between how she named Seth here and how she named Cain back in chapter 4, verse 1.
Oh, yeah, that's crucial.
Remember, with Cain, she said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord.
Which sounds positive on the surface.
But scholars like John Sailhammer point out that the Hebrew verb she used there, quana, I have gotten.
It forms a wordplay on Cain's name, Quain.
Right, and it can carry this tone of personal accomplishment, maybe even a sense of pride in her own role in obtaining this child.
Perhaps even thinking he was the promised seed of Genesis 3.15.
Exactly. Like, look what I did with God's help.
That's such a crucial observation. It's almost like she was saying, look what I have acquired or gotten.
But here, with Seth, her language shifts dramatically.
Completely.
She says, God has granted me another child. The Hebrew verb she uses here is she.
She, meaning to set, to appoint, or to grant. It creates the wordplay with Seth's name.
And the subject of the verb has changed. It's no longer I have gotten, but God has granted.
That's not just a subtle difference, is it?
Not at all. It reflects a clear, significant shift in her understanding, her faith, her perspective on her own role.
She now explicitly and humbly acknowledges God alone as the sovereign giver.
The one who has set up or granted this son specifically as a divine replacement for Abel.
It shows a renewed trust, a submission to God's provision and plan.
A perspective likely forged and refined in that deep suffering and loss she had just experienced through Cain's actions.
Absolutely. Suffering often clarifies our theology, doesn't it?
It certainly seems to have here. And the notes emphasize that Seth's birth isn't just presented as a natural event.
No, it's framed as a direct divine response to Abel's death.
Signifying God's intention to continue the godly line, the line of the promised seed, the Zerah.
Which connects us right back to that foundational promise in Genesis 3.15.
About the seed of the woman who would eventually crush the serpent's head.
Seth is clearly positioned here as the carrier of that vital promise.
The lineage through whom God's redemptive purpose will move forward.
Despite human failure, sin's devastating effects, and even death itself,
That connection to the seed of the woman is just fundamental for understanding the sweep of Genesis and the entire biblical narrative, isn't it?
It absolutely is. This genealogy isn't just recording family history, it's tracing the thread of redemption.
Seth isn't merely a replacement son?
No, he is the divinely appointed one through whom the lineage leading eventually to Abraham, to Israel, and ultimately to the Messiah will come. This is, salvation history unfolding right here in chapter 4.
Okay, let's move on to verse 26 then. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord.
So the godly line continues through Seth to his son Enosh.
Enosh. And his name is interesting, too.
It is quite interesting in this context. Like Adam, it means man.
Right.
But it often carries a connotation of human frailty, weakness, or mortality.
Oh, right. Especially in poetic texts.
Exactly. Like Psalm 8.4, what is man, Enosh, that you are mindful of him? So this naming might subtly reflect a growing, perhaps painful awareness in this generation of human limitation, suffering.
And the pervasive reality of death that was now undeniably part of the human experience after the fall. Life was proving to be fragile.
It certainly was.
And that adds a layer of meaning, doesn't it? Because this generation, aware of their frailty, is precisely when that landmark spiritual event happens. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord.
A pivotal moment.
So what does this phrase, quarai jom yhwh, to call on the name of the Lord, truly signify here? Is it just private prayer, or is it something more?
Well, the notes referencing scholars like Gordon Wenham make it pretty clear. This phrase is used later in Genesis to describe the characteristic public worship of patriarchs.
Like Abraham and Isaac at their altars.
Exactly. So this wasn't just individuals praying alone in their tents.
It signifies the very beginning of formal, public, and crucially, corporate worship.
Right. It marks the establishment of a distinct, visible community of faith.
The godly line, standing in contrast to the other lineage developing alongside them.
The line of Cain.
So while Cain's line, as we saw in chapter 4, was focusing outward building cities for physical security, developing material culture, arts, technology.
All human endeavors, but pursued largely apart from a declared dependence on God.
Seth's line was turning inward and upward.
Yeah.
They were establishing a community whose identity was centered not on what they could build or acquire, but on invoking God's covenant name, YHWH.
Finding their security and identity in relationship with him through communal worship.
It's two fundamentally different responses to living in a fallen world right from the start.
Precisely. The notes describe this as potentially the first collective religious movement in the Bible.
A conscious, intentional turning toward God as a community.
It shows these two paths emerging right from the start of post-fall humanity. One focused on human achievement, self-sufficiency, earthly security,
and the other on acknowledging God's sovereignty, recognizing human frailty, and seeking refuge and identity in him through corporate worship.
This contrast between the Cain's way and the Seth's way is a foundational theme laid out very early in Genesis.
And it echoes throughout the rest of Scripture. That contrast is so stark and so relevant even now. Okay, let's move into chapter 5, where the narrative structure shifts again. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And he named them mankind when they were created.
Chapter 5 opens with a very formal heading, doesn't it? Almost documentary-like.
Zisor Teloshem. This is the written account of Adam's line.
And that word sefer strongly suggests a written document or record. It adds weight to the historicity and theological significance of this list.
And Toledot, that's that crucial structuring term we see multiple times in Genesis.
Right, marking the beginning of a new section. Here, focusing specifically on the descendants originating from Adam, the head of all humanity.
And this introduction, it doesn't just start the list. It immediately and purposefully connects this genealogy back to the original creation account in chapter 1.
It's a deliberate reminder, setting the theological context.
It reiterates that God created humanity in his likeness, made them male and female, blessed them,
with the mandate to be fruitful and fill the earth.
And even collectively named the human race mankind, Adam, when they were created.
It grounds the entire following list of names and lives in God's glorious original purpose and the inherent dignity he bestowed upon humanity at creation, like saying, remember where this all began.
Before the fall.
Exactly. And then right after that reminder of the glorious creation, we see a critical theological nuance introduced in verse 3, a profound shift that underscores the reality of the fall.
When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died.
In his own likeness, in his own image, by Alma.
That language deliberately mirrors Genesis 1.2627, but with that absolutely crucial difference, right?
Yes, the notes and scholars really zero in on this. Back in chapter 1, humanity was made in God's likeness and image.
But here, Seth is born in Adam's likeness and image.
Wow, that's such a significant shift. What does that imply?
Well, it means that while Seth still fundamentally bears the image of God because he's a descendant of Adam who was made in God's image,
That image is now being passed down, mediated, through a fallen human parent.
an image that is now marred, affected, stained by the consequences of sin and the fall.
Some scholars even suggest the reversal of the order likeness and image here, compared to image and likeness in chapter 1.
Might be a subtle literary hint pointing to this altered, perhaps diminished or damaged transmission of the image through fallen humanity.
Like the mirror is cracked when Seth receives the reflection.
That's a really powerful way to put it, a cracked mirror. It's a sobering and profoundly important reminder, isn't it?
It really is. The consequences of the fall weren't just limited to Adam and Eve's personal sin.
They affected the very nature, the very essence of what it means to be human.
And that affected nature is passed down through generations. We inherit not just the glory of being made in God's image, but also a fallen nature.
An image that is broken, distorted, even while the foundational dignity of bearing God's image remains.
That tension is critical to understanding the human condition.
And verse 4 introduces that rigid, almost hypnotic formula that will repeat for almost every person listed in the rest of the chapter.
The patriarch's age when the key son was born.
The remaining years of his life, during which the text explicitly mentions other sons and daughters were also born.
Showing life continued.
The total lifespan, followed by that stark, unavoidable forward conclusion, and then he died.
That mention of other sons and daughters is important too, isn't it?
Yes, it reminds us that despite sin, the curse, the reality of death,
God's original creation mandate in Genesis 1.28, be fruitful and increase in number, was still powerfully at work.
the blessing of procreation and the continuation of the human race persisted alongside the consequences of the curse.
It's the simultaneous reality of blessing and curse, life and death, that defines the human experience in this fallen world.
And that final phrase, "and then he died," it becomes more than just a statement of fact.
As K.A. Matthews observes in the NEC commentary, it functions as a powerful, almost mournful, relentless drumbeat echoing throughout this chapter.
The literary echo of God's original sentence in the garden in Genesis 2.1 Sitsi, "You will surely die."
Every single person listed in this genealogy, despite their incredibly long lifespans, ultimately succumbs to this fate.
Well, almost everyone. There's that one exception.
Enoch, right? Enoch, who walked with God, and even his end is described differently. But for everyone else,
Death.
it's far more than just a list of names, ages, and begettings. It's a profound theological statement about the universal consequence of Adam's sin.
And the pervasive reign, the dominion of death over all humanity from this point forward.
As Alan P. Ross puts it, this constant refrain underscores the desperate need for someone, a redeemer, a messiah, to eventually break death's power.
To overturn its dominion, reverse the curse.
This stark reality, narrated in chapter 5, sets the stage and creates the longing for the rest of the biblical story.
Moving on through the chapter, that rigid, repetitive pattern established with Adam continues for Seth, Enosh, and the following generations. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. After he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived a total of 905 years, and then he died.
And we see that almost monotonous formula continue, meticulously tracing the specific line of promise, the Sethite lineage.
Seth, as we discussed, is central as the divinely appointed replacement for Abel.
Ensuring the continuation of the godly line. His impressive lifespan, 912 years, is recorded.
Then Enosh, in whose time people began that crucial activity of calling on the name of the Lord.
It's listed with a lifespan of 905 years. We then see the introduction of Kenan.
Whose name Kenan is interestingly similar phonetically to Cain.
Right, yet he clearly belongs to the Sethite line, the line characterized by worship and seeking relationship with God.
That similarity in name between Cain and Kenan across the two lineages is quite striking, isn't it?
It is, and it highlights a key point.
The two lines diverged, not based on similar-sounding names or even superficial external characteristics.
But fundamentally based on their foundational relationship with God.
One line, Cain's, focused on human progress, self-reliance, building their own kingdom.
Which ultimately led to violence and spiritual decay, a trajectory away from God.
The other, Seth's line, despite its focus on names and lifespans rather than achievements,
Was centered on acknowledging God, seeking Him through worship, and preserving a spiritual heritage amidst the inescapable reality of death.
Exactly. And the powerful repetition of that formula, lived, became the father of lived, had other sons and daughters, and then he died.
It serves multiple crucial narrative and theological purposes.
It emphasizes the continuing presence and effectiveness of God's blessing in the propagation of life, ensuring humanity didn't simply die out.
But even more starkly, it highlights the inescapable, universal, and devastating reality of the curse of death resulting from sin.
Every single individual in this list, except for the unique case of Enoch,
faces this same ultimate end. It drives home the point that death is the common destiny for fallen humanity.
The notes point out that these remarkably long lifespans are a defining feature of this antediluvian pre-flood era.
And while the precise interpretation of these ages is complex, debated for centuries,
their narrative function within the text seems clear.
They serve to bridge the vast span of time from creation and the fall to the great flood of Noah's day.
And they also powerfully demonstrate that God's promised lineage, this fragile thread of hope carried through Seth, endured and continued through many generations.
Despite the pervasive and relentless presence of death that affected everyone, life was long, but death was certain.
Yes, the very formulaic, almost rigid structure itself contributes significantly to the overarching message.
It shows a kind of ordered progression through history,
suggesting that even in a world increasingly overshadowed by sin and death, there is a divine superintendence, a plan unfolding according to God's purposes.
It's a stark, almost monotonous reality conveyed through this list, emphasizing the heavyweight and universal dominion of mortality on every single generation after Adam.
It's not just a list of names, it's a theological argument about the human condition outside of God's full restoration. #tag scholarly insights. It's genuinely fascinating how scholars look at these seemingly simple lists and unpack such profound layers of meaning. They connect them to the broader biblical narrative and even the ancient world in ways we might miss.
Absolutely. And one observation our notes highlight, which we've touched on, is that significant literary and theological contrast the Bible is deliberately drawing between the two lineages in chapters 4 and 5.
It's definitely more than just listing descendants.
Right. Bruce Waltling, a highly respected Old Testament scholar, points this out very clearly. Cain's genealogy in chapter 4 is detailed in terms of its cultural achievements.
Building the first city, Enoch. Developing arts like music with Jubal, metallurgy with Tubal Cain.
Exactly. This lineage represents human civilization building itself up, creating security and culture, but often apart from direct dependence on God.
But this progress is tragically framed by violence, isn't it? Starting with fratricide.
And culminating in Lamech's chilling, boastful song of vengeance.
It illustrates the inherent corruption and decay that sets in within a civilization built purely on human effort and self-reliance, detached from its creator.
And in striking contrast, Seth's genealogy in chapter 5 seems almost bare.
Repetitive, dominated by that relentless, and then he died.
It doesn't list any cultural achievements, no great feats of building or invention.
Yet, Waltling compellingly argues that this very lack of external accomplishment points to the genealogy's true focus.
Which is?
The fragile but enduring transmission of God's image, despite the overwhelming shadow of death and the image being mediated through fallen humanity.
As Genesis 5.3 notes, in his own likeness, in his own image.
The godly line faithfully passes down that inherent dignity from God.
That contrast is so powerful. Cain's way versus Seth's way.
The hope in Seth's line doesn't come from human building projects or technological advancement.
No, it comes from God's preservation of this lineage, and crucially, from individuals within it, like Enoch, who chose to actively walk with God in relationship.
It's a path defined by dependence on and relationship with the divine, not by constructing earthly empires or accumulating worldly power as the ultimate goal.
This sets up a fundamental tension we see throughout the Bible, relying on human strength versus depending on God.
It gives us such a clear lens to view different approaches to life, even ministry today, doesn't it?
It really does. Are we building the church like a Canaanite city focusing on size, programs, external metrics?
Or like a Sethite community centered on calling on the name of the Lord, acknowledging our frailty, and passing on a spiritual heritage?
That's a profound question for reflection. Another crucial point scholars raise, especially about those extraordinary lifespans, is the ancient Near Eastern context.
Yes. John Walton, who's done so much work on the Old Testament in its ancient context.
Drawing from resources like the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary.
He offers a vital perspective here. He compares the Genesis 5 lifespans to texts like the Sumerian king list.
Ah, yes. That list records pre-flood kings reigning for, well, impossibly long periods.
Tens of thousands of years sometimes.
Compared to those figures, the ages in Genesis, while still immense to us over 900 years,
Appear remarkably restrained. Within that ancient cultural context, they might have seemed relatively more grounded.
Maybe realistic is too strong a word, but certainly more restrained. But Walton's point isn't primarily about the numbers themselves.
What is it then?
He suggests the Genesis author isn't just copying these ancient lists and reducing the numbers, they're engaging in a deliberate theological counter-narrative.
A counter-narrative. How so?
Well, those ancient king lists weren't just historical records, they functioned theologically and politically.
To deify rulers, legitimize their power, link them to the divine realm through longevity.
Exactly. Longevity signaled closeness to the gods and inherent authority.
While Genesis 5 also records long lives, its fundamental purpose is different.
Radically different, even oppositional. It's not a list of kings intended to deify human rulers or legitimize power through longevity.
It's a list of humanity, the lineage of Adam.
And crucially, all are presented as ultimately subject to death. That constant repeating refrain, "and then he died," serves a powerful de-deifying function.
It emphasizes the universal mortality of all people, even the oldest and seemingly most significant patriarchs.
So in the Genesis account, human dignity and significance don't come from near divine longevity or earthly power.
They come from being made in God's image and having the capacity for relationship with Him, for walking with God.
This perspective directly challenges the political theologies and power structures of the ancient world.
It recenters history, value, and legitimacy, not on human rulers or their achievements, but on God and humanity's relationship with Him.
It's a subtle but truly radical statement in its time.
That really helps put the biblical account in its original context and shows how countercultural its message was, even back then. It foregrounds a God-centered view of history.
And connecting this forward, Klaus Westermann, the renowned German Old Testament scholar,
Yes.
he offers a profound insight into the theological function of genealogies like this one within the broader biblical narrative, particularly salvation history.
Oh, that's interesting. What does he point out?
He points out that it's highly significant, not just coincidence, that salvation history in both the Old and New Testaments often begins or is prefaced by genealogies.
Like Genesis 5 leading towards Noah, then Abraham.
Right. And the Gospels of Matthew and Luke both painstakingly trace Jesus' lineage.
With Luke specifically going all the way back to Adam.
Exactly. Matthew starts with Abraham, connecting Jesus to the covenant promises and Israel.
While Luke starts with Adam, connecting Jesus to all of humanity, emphasizing his role as the universal redeemer.
Westermann argues powerfully that this consistent use of genealogies demonstrates something crucial. That God's saving action in Christ is not an isolated, sudden, or purely spiritual event disconnected from the physical, historical world.
It's deeply rooted in.
And the culmination of his long, patient work of blessing, preserving, and working through humanity throughout all of history, starting literally from creation.
So the Genesis 5 genealogy of the godly line is presented as like the very first structural pillar of this grand unfolding salvation history.
That's a great way to put it. It shows that Jesus' human existence, his role as Redeemer, they aren't separate from this long, complex human story.
They are its absolute climax, the glorious culmination of God's faithfulness in preserving that seed of the woman lineage across millennia.
Westermann suggests that viewing salvation as purely spiritual, divorced from this concrete historical lineage traced in genealogies like Genesis 5, is to miss a central biblical point.
The gospel is profoundly historical, woven into the very fabric of human time and generations.
That ties this ancient list directly to the very heart of our faith. It's part of the essential historical and theological groundwork for understanding God's redemptive plan.
And just circling back for one more subtle but incredibly powerful insight. Sailhamer's observation about Eve's name-giving in chapter 4.
Oh, yes. That's so insightful. It adds such a personal dimension to the theology.
It really does. John Sailhamer highlights that deliberate telling contrast in Eve's words when naming Cain.
Using the verb klana, I have gotten, punning on Cain's name, Quain.
Sailhamer suggests this carried a tone of human agency, maybe pride, a focus on her role in obtaining this child, perhaps thinking she had produced the promised deliverer.
It's about her accomplishment in getting him.
But then, after the unimaginable pain of Abel's death and Cain's banishment,
Her language for Seth shifts dramatically. She uses the verb shith, God has granted me, or God has appointed me.
which puns on Seth's name, Sheth. The subject is no longer I getting something, but God sovereignly granting or appointing.
It's a fundamental shift from focusing on her own role to humbly acknowledging that this son is a pure, sovereign gift from God's grace.
Given specifically by him in their moment of despair.
It's subtle linguistic detail, but it reveals a profound shift in her spiritual state, her theological understanding.
Forged in the crucible of suffering.
She moves from potential pride or self-reliance to complete dependence on and deep gratitude for God's sovereign grace and provision.
It's a beautiful, poignant picture of a human heart turning back to fully acknowledge God's control and gracious action in a fallen, painful world. #tag today's application. It's truly remarkable, isn't it? How these ancient accounts, these lists, these nuances speak so powerfully and directly to our lives today.
It really is.
Though considering everything we've discussed, the new beginnings after tragedy, the nature of worship, the reality of mortality, the contrasting lineages, the scholarly insights, what are some core messages, some vital reminders for us today, particularly for those involved in ministry?
Well, one absolutely key reminder, drawn so clearly from the birth of Seth, is about God's persistent grace and faithfulness in providing new beginnings.
Right. Think about Adam and Eve's situation after Abel's death and Cain's exile.
It must have felt like utter despair, the end of everything. The thread of hope seems severed.
Yet, in his sovereignty and grace, God provides Seth.
And Eve's words, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, make it explicit she recognized this as a direct, gracious, divine provision.
A lifeline thrown to them in their deepest need.
This is such a powerful and eternally relevant message for us today, isn't it?
Absolutely. When we face profound loss, personal grief, church decline, ministry failure, or when circumstances seem darkest.
And the story of Seth, the divinely appointed replacement, reminds us that God is fundamentally, undeniably, a God of new beginnings.
He is utterly faithful to preserve his redemptive plan in his people.
He has the power and the grace to raise up hope, new life, possibility, from what seem like impossible circumstances.
From the ashes of our failures, the pain of our losses.
It's a powerful call for us, especially in ministry, to cling to his faithfulness and believe in his ability to bring about new life and resurrection, even when we can't see a human way forward.
We must never underestimate God's power to bring life from death, literally and figuratively.
Absolutely. Another crucial point drawn directly from Enosh's era is the absolute centrality of worship.
That statement. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. It marks a foundational spiritual development for the Sethite line.
The godly lineage. This shift to publicly and corporately invoking God's covenant name stands in such stark contrast to the Cainite focus.
Their focus on building cities and pursuing human achievements as the ultimate source of security and identity.
It shows us that the proper, God-ordained, fundamental human response to God,
especially when we're aware of our inherent frailty and dependence, which Enosh's name potentially hints at,
is to turn towards him in worship.
Worship publicly identifying with God, declaring who he is, invoking his name together as a community. It's not just an activity of God's people.
It's presented here as the foundational activity that defines them and distinguishes them from the world.
Yes. The notes help us see that it's the very basis for building a genuinely godly culture and community.
And the primary means by which faith is sustained within that community and faithfully passed from one generation to the next.
This isn't about neglecting private devotion, which is vital.
Not at all. But it emphasizes that the gathered community corporately declaring God's nature and works is essential.
For pastors and church leaders, this is a critical reminder, isn't it?
Absolutely vital. Prioritizing, cultivating, teaching about meaningful, reverent, authentic corporate worship isn't secondary.
It's not just one program among many.
No, it is absolutely central to forming a godly community, strengthening faith, and faithfully passing the baton of belief to the next generation.
We need to ask ourselves, how are we intentionally emphasizing and teaching our people how and why to truly call on the name of the Lord together in our public gatherings.
Is it the core of our identity as a church?
That makes worship not just something we do, but who we are. And then there's that inescapable, sobering reality brought home so relentlessly by chapter 5's refrain.
And then he died. Despite those incredibly long lives, death was the inevitable conclusion for almost everyone listed.
This steady, rhythmic, undeniable repetition serves as a stark, unavoidable reminder of universal human mortality.
And the pervasive, inescapable consequence of Adam's sin that has affected every single person born since.
This truth should compel us to humility, forcing us to recognize the brevity and fragility of our own lives.
But it should also instill a deep sense of urgency and intentionality about how we live and use the time God has given us.
Living deliberately, purposefully, knowing our days are numbered, living in the light of eternity.
And crucially, this reality of death, chronicled so starkly in Genesis 5, powerfully magnifies the glory and the absolute necessity of the gospel.
Yes. This unbroken chain, this universal reign of death marking every generation after Adam,
Is precisely what Jesus Christ, the ultimate descendant of this very lineage, came into the world to break.
through his own substitutionary death and his triumphant resurrection.
His victory over death is the glorious, definitive, climactic answer to the somber, relentless drumbeat of Genesis 5.
So for those in ministry, this means we mustn't shy away from the reality of death in our preaching and pastoral care.
We have to acknowledge the pain, the grief, the finality it brings in this fallen world.
But we must always and consistently point to Christ as the one who has fully overcome it, disarmed its power, provided hope beyond the grave.
This truth shapes how we comfort the grieving, how we teach about the hope of resurrection,
And how we encourage believers to live purposeful, kingdom-focused lives for God now.
knowing our time here is finite and our true eternal security and identity lie beyond death's reach because of Christ's finished work. It gives ultimate meaning to life and death.
And finally, wrapping back to the lineages, our notes also emphasize that profound pattern of faith transmission within families and larger lineages.
That striking contrast between Cain's violent, self-reliant line and Seth's worshiping line. It underscores the truth that faith, or its absence, is significantly passed down.
Nurtured or neglected through generations within the context of family and community.
This is a crucial, maybe one of the most challenging reminders for pastors, for parents, for every believer.
The family unit, in its broadest biblical sense, and the wider community of faith, the church,
Are the primary, God-ordained places where faith is nurtured, modeled, intentionally taught, and transmitted.
the spiritual heritage we faithfully pass on is infinitely more valuable and enduring than any material wealth or worldly achievements.
More valuable than anything the Cainites could build.
So in our ministries and in our homes, how can we more effectively support families and individuals in intentionally cultivating and passing down a genuine, living, Sethite-like faith?
How do we actively, counterculturally challenge the powerful pull of worldly values that focus on external success, self-reliance, material security?
Values so reminiscent of the Cainite culture, constantly competing for the hearts and allegiances of the next generation.
This passage calls us not just to believe, but to be intentional, generational, spiritual stewards. #summary. So to quickly recap our deep dive into Genesis 4.25 through 5.1, we've journeyed through a really critical transition in the early human story.
We saw how it moves from the deep darkness after Cain's actions to the emergence of a new line of hope through Seth.
A child recognized by Eve as specifically granted or appointed by God as a divine replacement for Abel, ensuring the continuation of the redemptive line.
We then explored the significance of Seth's son, Enosh, and that pivotal moment when people began formal, public, corporate worship, actively calling on the name of the Lord.
This foundational spiritual activity stands in stark contrast to the outward-focused, self-reliant pursuits of Cain's descendants, highlighting two fundamentally different responses.
Chapter 5 introduced the formal Toledot genealogy structure. We discussed how it connects back to creation, emphasizes the transmission of God's image through fallen humanity,
A marred image now, mediated through sinful parents.
and features that pervasive, somber reality of death, and then he died, affecting everyone due to sin.
We delved into powerful scholarly insights, including Bruce Waltzy's contrast between the two genealogies, worldly achievement versus spiritual heritage.
And John Walton's perspective on the long lifespans, showing Genesis's unique theological focus on human mortality and God's centrality, not deifying rulers.
We also learned from Claus Westermann about these genealogies as fundamental structural pillars of salvation history, rooting Christ's work in history.
And John Selhammer's point about Eve's linguistic shift, showing a spiritual move from self-reliance to dependence on God's grace after suffering.
And finally, we reflected on those vital, timeless reminders for us today, especially for ministry leaders.
God's faithfulness in new beginnings, the essential centrality of corporate worship,
The sobering reality of mortality pointing us to hope in Christ's victory.
and the crucial role of intentionally passing on genuine faith generationally. Hashtag faith reflection, Pastor's Angle. So considering that striking contrast, we've seen the Canaanite line focused intently on earthly achievement, building, securing their own future apart from God, versus the Sethite line focused on calling on God's name, acknowledging frailty, patiently transmitting God's image amidst mortality. Here's a question for reflection, especially for those of you pastoring and leading congregations today.
How do we effectively pastor and lead churches in a culture that, let's be honest, often relentlessly emphasizes worldly metrics of success, external achievement, personal security, material progress, building impressive institutions, much like that Canaanite culture? How do we consistently and deeply ground our people in the Sethite values instead?
How do we help them truly prioritize faithfully worshiping God together, humbly acknowledging our shared human frailty and dependence?
And finding our true, enduring hope, identity, and security not in what we build or achieve for ourselves, but solely in bearing God's image, being part of his preserved, redeemed lineage in Christ, and belonging to his kingdom, which is ultimately not of this world.
How do we preach, teach, and live in a way that makes the Sethite path compellingly attractive and deeply formative in a world so often dominated by Kenite values?
That's a profound challenge and perhaps a lifelong task for pastoral ministry. #outro.
What a remarkably rich passage and such valuable, challenging insights from our study note today. There's truly so much in these foundational chapters of Genesis to keep pondering.
Absolutely. We've, only scratched the surface in this deep dive, but hopefully it provides you with new perspectives, deeper understanding, and practical insights.
For your own personal study, and perhaps more importantly, for your preaching, teaching, and pastoral care as you lead others in the faith.
We strongly encourage you to revisit Genesis 4.25 through 5.11. Read it again with these insights in mind.
Reflect on the contrast between the two lineages, the significance of worship, the reality of death, in light of the hope we have in Christ.
See how it further illuminates your understanding of God's faithfulness throughout human history and the profound story he is weaving, ultimately pointing towards the Redeemer who overcomes it all.